Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, the Public Sector Governance Bill makes interesting reading. According to the long title of the bill, it seeks to provide for a consistent governance framework across the public bodies and to support a whole-of-government approach to the delivery of services. To this end, the bill has several aspects. On the one hand, it aims to standardize certain policies and practices that cut across the different public sector agencies, such as personnel matters, governance, and managing conflicts of interest, and financial administration. These are set out in Parts 3, 4, and 5 of the bill. More critically, Part 2 prescribes the accountability relationships between government ministers and the public sector agencies. These accountability provisions set out how ministers should interface with public sector agencies, which wield significant state power over Singaporeans on a daily basis. How should ministers behave, and what are the boundaries that ministers should not cross? I shall focus my speech on this aspect of the bill. Sir, Clause 3 of the bill states that one of the bill's aims is to, and I quote, clarify the accountability relationship between public bodies, their members, their responsible ministers, and the government, unquote. As one would assume that the government would not legislate without cause, I would ask the minister to explain why it is necessary to clarify in explicit legislation the accountability relationships between the ministers and the public sector agencies. Are ministers or the agencies confused about their roles? Why legislate rather than issue guidelines on this? Is there concern from the public service officials that they are being subject to political pressure from ministers? Part 2 of the bill talks about ministers issuing directions to agencies. However, the word directions is not defined. I note that under Clause 9, it is provided that the directions may take the form of a circular or instruction or order. But Clause 9 says that the directions may take such a format, not that they must take such a format. Is it safe to assume then that directions have to be in writing and signed or authenticated by the minister? Can the permanent secretary, for example, sign off? Is there anything prohibiting directions in the form of emails? Or going further, can directions even be oral? Part 2 envisages two types of directions from ministers: directions for whole-of-government approach and directions to certain statutory boards regarding functional responsibilities. First, directions on whole-of-government approach. Under Clause 4, directions for a whole-of-government approach will relate only to a pertinent subject matter. These pertinent subject matters are restricted to 5 areas as set out at Subclause 3. First, employment, management and discipline of employees. Second, management of official documents. Third, financial and resource management and accountability. Fourth, use or development of IT. And fifth, data governance and sharing. Such whole-of-government directions are to be issued by, I presume, the Prime Minister's office on the recommendation of the minister in charge of the pertinent subject matter. In addition, the directions can only be issued for the purposes set out at Clause 4.2, such as securing economies of scale, efficiency of public programs, ensuring business continuity, and managing financial risks. Overall, I welcome the thought process behind Clause 4 and the implied reminder to ministers that directions should not be issued for extraneous purposes. Next, I move on to directions to Group 1 statutory boards. The second type of directions are to be issued under Clause 5 to specific statutory boards on the performance of their specific functions. The statutory boards in question are listed in the schedule to the bill under Group 1A and Group 1B of the first schedule. These bodies total 50 in number and include major public functions that affect the lives of Singaporeans across the board. For example, the Accounting and Corporate Regulatory Authority, the Central Provident Fund Board, the Housing and Development Board, Land Transport Authority, and Public Utilities Board. I also understand from the Minister that he will be moving an amendment in committee to include the Group 1C public body, namely People's Association, under Clause 5 as well. Clause 5 states that such agency-specific directions are to be issued by the ministers responsible for those agencies. Implied here is the drawing of a line that other ministers have no authority to give instructions to agencies not under their charge concerning the agency's functions. In this regard, it would be important to understand the spirit behind this provision. According to the explanatory note, there are currently inconsistencies, and this clause will help to avoid duplication of laws. Could the minister give an illustration of this problem so that one can better understand how Clause 5 will help? Next, I move on to limits on ministerial directions. This is contained in Clause 11, an all-important clause which seeks to limit the minister's powers to issue directions to public sector agencies. Clause 11 provides that a minister's directions must not be contrary to written law. A ministerial direction is also not binding if it would impede or affect the performance of a statutorily independent function of a public sector agency or a quasi-judicial function of a public sector agency in a particular matter. To enable greater public understanding of this point, can the minister give some examples of such functions? Earlier, I believe he mentioned the courts, which are an obvious example, but it would be helpful if he could mention other examples. Furthermore, should there be a doubt as to whether a direction from a minister is contrary to law or tantamount to an undermining of that body's independence or quasi-judicial function, how will such an issue be resolved? Who should the public sector agencies complain to? Next, Clause 11, Subclause 3 goes further to say that ministers are not authorized to direct any public sector agency or any public body or public officer to perform or not to perform a particular act with respect to a particular person or persons. I have a few queries about this. First, the clause is very widely worded as there is no definition of what sorts of acts are contemplated. Read literally, does this mean, for example, that henceforth a minister cannot direct a statutory board to scrutinize the accounts of a particular company? Does this mean ministers cannot instruct ministry or state boards to issue specific media releases affecting particular persons? Next, which agencies are protected under this clause from ministerial abuse? Clause 11 says that ministers cannot issue the offending directions to public sector agencies, which is defined in Clause 2 to mean statutory boards listed in Groups 1, 2, and 3 of the schedule, a ministry or department of government, an organ of state, or a public officer or person as gazetted by the minister. Public bodies are also mentioned in Clause 11, which means it protects all statutory boards, even those not listed in the schedule. To be absolutely clear, does Clause 11 apply to the public service, which is defined to include the armed forces, the civil defense force, and the police? Are these considered departments of the government and therefore public sector agencies for the purposes of this bill? This is important because if Clause 11 applies to these services, a minister would not be able to direct them to take particular actions, for example, to direct the police to arrest a particular person. Third, sir, while these restrictions on ministerial directions are impressive on paper, they appear to me easy to circumvent. For instance, what is there to stop a minister from speaking to a public officer on the side to get such things done, thus bypassing the prohibitions in Clause 11? Finally, sir, according to the explanatory note, Clause 11 is there to, and I quote, ensure that the public sector, like the Singapore Public Service, does not become politicized, unquote. This sounds well and good on paper, and there also seems to be an assumption that the public service is not politicized. But with a public sector that has known only one ruling party for nearly 60 years, how do we entrench a culture of political neutrality of the civil service in substance? How do we achieve depoliticization in reality? For instance, buried in our statute books is a piece of legislation called the People's Association Conduct and Discipline Rules. These rules expressly state that, and I quote, every employee shall refrain from engaging in party political activity and shall maintain complete reserve in all matters of party political controversy, unquote. Besides this, I believe there are similar pronouncements elsewhere. But are these codes being observed on a daily basis? Are the ministers themselves all mindful of letting public servants do their jobs professionally and not putting them under political pressure? So let me conclude. This bill is an attempt to entrench the relationships of accountability and demarcate out-of-bounds markers for ministers vis-à-vis the public sector agencies. That is certainly a good thing. The Workers' Party welcomes this development after nearly 60 years under the same ruling party. Nevertheless, as I've said, I have some doubts and concerns about how the bill will be operationalized and what appear to be gaps that may allow the bill's intentions to be circumvented.